In this 20-minute presentation, we'll be exploring power, gender, and Buddhism's future. We'll reflect on where we've been, where we are, and how we could continue to shape a more inclusive and compassionate spiritual practice. Okay, let's see. So let's begin with an audience poll. Raise your hand if you've heard of Mahapajapati Gautami, the Buddha's stepmother. I can't even see. Raise your hand if you know how the story of how she became the first nun to join the Buddhist Sangha. And finally, raise your hand if you've read chapter 5 of Budding Lotus in the West of my book. Okay, so I'm so sorry. It's like this, I can't see what hands were raised, so maybe during our personal reflections later, you can shed more about your experience and your engagement with this particular story. But I just wanted to preface this to kind of put out a question that we don't often ask, like what if the version of the story we know isn't what actually happened? We all know that Buddhism as a tradition is rooted in compassion, wisdom, inner transformation, and liberation. And yet, like every major religion, it is not immune to patriarchal narratives and structures that marginalize women and other disadvantaged groups. If we look at the early discourses of the Buddha, we see a very different story, but the systemic challenges that women continue to face are narratives that continue to convey women as spiritually inferior, such as this verse here in the Pali Canon that states that it's impossible for a woman to be a perfected one, a fully awakened Buddha, but it's possible for a man to be a perfected one, a fully awakened Buddha. And that's, the Pali Canon, which is the text for the Theravada tradition. And then with the Mahayana tradition, we also have misogynist narratives in their texts, such as this verse here from the Great Nirvana Sutra. All good men and women desire to be born as a man. Why so? Because females are the nest of evil. And the texter side, we have patriarchal structures and rules that favor men. And the most obvious example for me is like in all traditions, nuns must follow over 300 precepts, whereas monks typically follow around 250 or less. And yet, when we look at Buddhism as a whole and the spectrum of all the texts, especially the early Buddhist texts in the Pali Canon, we see a different story. The Buddha explicitly taught that enlightenment is accessible to everyone, regardless of birth, gender, class, background. Enlightenment is not a matter of biology, but a matter of inner transformation. It's about overcoming suffering, understanding reality, attaining liberation through ethical conduct, through practicing mindfulness, and developing wisdom. So those qualities, none of them check out gender before they decide to manifest. And if you look at the second verse on this slide, the Buddha explicitly said that any monk or nun who develops such and such qualities can expect one of two results: enlightenment in this present life, or if there's something left over, non-return. So these are just a few examples, but there are numerous texts that affirm that enlightenment is an innate potential within all of us. And yet, as I mentioned yesterday, how the Buddha states that he has disciples who are competent monks and nuns, laymen, laywomen, And he encouraged all of us to come together, especially after his passing, to recite the teachings, comparing meaning by meaning, phrase with phrase, so that the spiritual path would last for a long time. But the 6 Buddhist councils from 410 BCE to 1950s present day, only monks participated. Like women and lay people were excluded. So it's not surprising then that the Buddhism that we have today is shaped by texts and traditions that favor men, sometimes at the expense of women's spiritual legacy. And as a result of that, some Buddhist traditions today still deny women full ordination. And in some cases, nuns live as partially ordained or 10 precept nuns, receiving no financial support, no access to equal training or education, and little recognition, and often assigned domestic roles in exchange for room and board instead of like spiritual leadership. And this exclusion is often justified with one particular story, the Gautama Sutta, which is a story that can be found in all major texts, traditions, texts of all of the major Buddhist traditions today, which tells the story of the first nun ordination. And the tradition, the text, each of them varies a little bit, but the gist of it, it's like this. The 5th year of the Buddha's ministry, King Suddhodana, the Buddha's father, passed away. So his stepmother, Mahapajapati Gautami, requested ordination from the Buddha 3 times. He refused all 3. And then his attendant, Ananda, intervened. And the Buddha finally agreed, but with a catch. He imposes the 8 Garudhammas, or rules of respect, that permanently subordinate nuns to monks. And I'm highlighting some of the 8 rules here. The first one, a nun, no matter how senior, must always bow to even the most junior monk. Nuns must seek instruction from monks twice a month. Nuns must be ordained by both monks and nuns, while monks require no such approval. Nuns may never verbally abuse or insult monks. Nuns may not criticize monks, but monks are free to criticize nuns. And then the Buddha delivers the final blow. After Gautami ordains, he compared the inclusion of women in the monastic order to crimes, diseases, natural disasters. And then he tells Ananda that had women not been allowed to go forth, his teachings would have lasted 1,000 years. But now that woman is part of his Sangha, Buddhism would decline within 500 years. And the sutta ends there. It's a striking statement, especially when the Buddha, who elsewhere taught people take responsibility for their own karma, suddenly blame an entire gender for Buddhism's supposed decline. And then the Buddha, who elsewhere taught not self, non-identity, interconnectedness, and that all beings could attain enlightenment, suddenly imposed these unequal, oppressive rules on women and nuns. To understand this, we need to look at the historical context. In my book, I propose that this narrative didn't originate with the Buddha, but emerged later when the Sangha was facing internal and external crisis. Some monks likely saw women's ordination as a threat to their authority, but it wasn't just about control. It was also about scapegoating. After the Buddha's passing, the Buddhist community faced a lot of challenges, like corruption within the Sangha, growing hostility from the Brahmin Hindu rulers, factional divisions, and later like violent invasions that led Buddhism to a period of decline. And amidst the instability, the community needed someone to blame, and nuns became the scapegoat. So rather than confronting the deeper systemic issues, blame is placed on those with the least power. And the Gautami Sutta became the perfect justification. But yet, if we dive deep into the texts, there are glaring inconsistencies and contradictions throughout. For one, the Vinaya, the monastic code text, states that the Buddha didn't impose any rules for the first 20 years of his ministry, because all of his early disciples were advanced practitioners who behaved accordingly. So how could he have laid down these 8 rules for nuns in year 5 of his ministry? And then another issue is that the Buddha stated that he wouldn't set down any rules until causes of corruption appear in the Sangha. And additionally, he only crafted 1 rule at a time as specific situations come up. So how could he deliver 8 rigid rules all at once on nuns who hadn't engaged in any corrupted behavior? And then there's Ananda. The Gautami story suggests that he was instrumental in advocating for nuns' ordination. But if we trace his timeline, there's a verse attributed to him in the Pali Canon itself that suggests he was ordained in the 20th year of the Buddha's ministry. He said he was a trainee for 15 years after the Buddha passed, and the Buddha passed at 80. So that means it's like when the Buddha was 55 was when he ordained. So that means that if the nun ordination took place in the 5th year of the Buddha's ministry, then Ananda was like a child, 5 years old. He wasn't even a monk yet. So how could he have played a role in this story? Then we have the Buddha's, character and teachings. The story portrays him as dismissive to his stepmother and not having as much compassion to women as Ananda, even to the point of equating women's ordination to crimes and disasters and diseases. Yet in numerous other texts, the Buddha emphasizes deep gratitude toward our parents, saying that we could never fully repay their kindness, and that the only way we could truly honor our parents is to guide them toward a virtuous life. Given this, does it make sense then that he would reject his stepmother's sincere request to follow the path of virtue, of wisdom and liberation? And then there's the issue of him being a fearless teacher who teaches fearlessness and personal accountability, and reassuring that like if you're fearless, if that like fear arises from attachment and desire, and that wisdom dissolves all these fear. But then in this story, he appears to be like anxious and worried about the longevity of his Dharma, which none of it adds up. And then finally, when we look at the over 3 dozen actual teachings where the Buddha talk about what makes the true Dharma faith, nowhere in all of these discourse does he single out women, nuns, or gender as the cause of any downfall. Instead, he's all about like the conduct of individuals, of their discipline, wisdom, sincerity in following the path. And he warns that the Dharma fades, not because of women, but because his followers fail to listen, or if they lack respect, or if they're fall into negligence, laziness, self-interest, greed. And then near the end of his life, like one of the longest suttas where he laid down 41 guidelines to prevent any decline in the Dharma, there was not a single, again, no reference to gender or women or any restrictive rules on nuns. And in fact, when he talks about like building an ideal Sangha, he was always like encouraging his disciples to practice in a way that invite more practitioners to come, and in a way that's inclusive and open and kind and generous, sharing even the food in your alms bowl and all of that. And so just in light of all of these other texts that contradicts the Gautama Sutta, it tells us that the sutta itself isn't the voice of the Buddha that we're hearing. It's actually the voice of later monks who, rather than upholding his true teachings, imposed their own biases, which ironically embodying the very behaviors that the Buddha warned would lead to the downfall of the Dharma. So in my book, I point out like, oh, isn't it interesting? Like all along, it's actually the monks, not the nuns, who kicked off the downward spiral. And yet to this day, tragically, many Buddhist traditions accept this Gautama Sutta, this Gautama story, as a true historical event. These 8 rules of respect continue to shape monastic structures, reinforcing the idea that nuns must always remain beneath monks, or that the non-regulation of nun ordination would lead to the decline of the Dharma. And what's most troublesome is that among all of the rules, this rule number 6, which states that nuns must be ordained by both monks and nuns, and in the Theravada countries, where the nuns' lineage reportedly went extinct centuries ago due to wars of famine or other political upheavals. And so present day, the monks are saying, well, without an existing nun order, new nuns cannot be ordained. And when Mahayana nuns like offered a hand to help restore their lineage, their help was rejected, with the Theravada monks claiming that accepting ordination from another tradition would disrupt the Theravada purity. So as a result, in many Theravada monasteries and temples and wats today, nuns and laywomen are either not allowed to ordain, or if they do ordain, they're partially ordained nuns or 10 nun precept, and are treated as second-class citizens, denied access to equal education or training or teaching opportunities. And Linda and Nelly brought this to my attention a few weeks ago when we had our first meet and greet. But the disparity has gotten to the point where in Thailand, a Theravada Buddhist country, out of 40,000 temples in Thailand, only 1 houses nuns. And make no mistake, the majority of monks in Thailand still resist the idea of fully ordained nuns. They refuse to recognize these nuns. And they will often use the Gautama Sutta and rule number 6 to justify their exclusion. That they can't ordain new nuns. No new nuns. It's possible because you guys went extinct. And what's also really troubling is that this is not just happening in the traditional Southeast Asian countries, but it persists in contemporary practices and structures like the 5-point declaration by an American Buddhist monk who was born in Seattle, by the way, Aja Sumito, and and his senior monks who practiced in the Thai forest tradition in the UK in 2009 introduced this policy that reinforced the subordination of the 10 precept nuns to monks within their tradition. And so even today, like the Gautama Sutta is not just like an outdated myth that's stuck away in our scriptures, but it's a story or sutta that continues to impact the full participation of women into Buddhism. So in my book, what can we do? There's so much to be done. You know, my stance is that all of us have a choice. We all have a role to play in Buddhism's present and future. And in my book, I propose some ideas and suggestions to help us move toward a more inclusive Buddhism, such as providing financial, material, and emotional support to women and nuns, to repeal the sexist laws, establish nunneries, empower women and nuns, include women in decision-making and public roles, share responsibilities, challenge implicit bias, promote respect, and offer training or engage in discussions to anyone who clings to these texts and refuse to help us move forward to a new future. And I just want to end with this quote by this text, sutta by the Buddha, where again reflects the vision of the Buddha for his Sangha, a path of wisdom and compassion and liberation for all beings, free from barriers, exclusion, expression. But to the Buddha, when he thinks about his community, he says, these 4 competent, educated, assured, learned people who have memorized the teachings and practice in line with the teachings beautify the Sangha. What for? A monk, a nun, a layman, and a laywoman.